In our first lecture, I will introduce the major themes and overall plan of our course. First, I will set out a set of reasons to study the material, and this is material that was written more than 3,000 years ago. Second, I will look at a number of different approaches to the study of myth, in general, and to the study of ancient Near Eastern myth in particular. And third, I will explain the thematically organized approach to the myths. And in this approach, we move from looking at the background of the myth, that is, looking at history, to an examination of individual stories. And the myths themselves are grouped thematically. We begin with myths of creation. We move to some of the great epics, such as the epics of the gods of Ugarit and the epic of Gilgamesh. And then we move to philosophical questions, to questions that are treated under the rubric of wisdom literature in the ancient Near East. So we will go through the plan of the course, and I will close this lecture with observations on the study of this subject, both within the academy and without the academy. So let us begin with a set of reasons to study this material. Well, first, the stories we're going to be reading are the oldest stories recorded. These are humanity's first stories, and there's no argument about that. There are claims that there are other older stories, but there are no other older written materials. So here we have the first stories from the cradle of civilization, a somewhat antiquated, charming 19th century term, but a term that I think is still relevant. A second reason is that these myths reflect social reality and tell us something about history. They do it in an oblique manner, not in a direct fashion, but we can learn a lot about the reality of the ancient East from these tales. And third, and surely not least, these stories offer us the pleasures of literature that can be read for sheer enjoyment. And I hope that you find pleasure in them. They are not only meant to be didactic. The people who wrote them so that others would enjoy them. How do I know this? They said so. They said these stories are for enjoyment. This is particularly true in the case of the Egyptian. We might think of these myths as the creative writing of the ancient world. There were no novels. There were no stories outside of epic poems. This is the way people expressed themselves. But there's a strange aspect to this creative writing. They didn't give us the names of the authors. So most of these texts are without attribution. Very strange for our sensibility, but very much in keeping with the tenor of these myths. Now, there's a great diversity of opinion about the meaning of the word myth. In popular parlance, myth is often opposed to truth. People will say that's a myth today, by which they mean it's not true. But in this course, we're not going to be using it in that sense. We're using it in the academic sense. Myth is sometimes restricted in a more technical definition to stories of the gods. When one studies Greek myth, that's still used to some extent. Legends are used to describe stories of people. Again, that's a distinction I'm not going to be using here. My definition is a more literary one. These are the great stories of the ancient Near East. That's what we're going to be looking at. And I will be focusing very often on questions of literary art and literary value. Genre is an important consideration because to find ancient Near Eastern myth, one cannot go to a collection made in antiquity of myth. That is, modern scholars have had to collect this material, often from fragments of tablets. In European folklore and myth, we have great collections. Grimm's fairy tales. The brothers Grimm went out into the German and European countryside and collected stories. We can go to that book in its various translated forms and get the great stories. No one did that in the ancient world. So there's a modern scholarly endeavor to recapture what the literary material from the ancient Near East was. For that reason, because this is collected material, we need to know that it's collected from many genres. It's collected from poetry, it's collected from religious ritual, and it's collected from things that might seem at first glance to not be mythic at all. Let me give you an example. One of the early civilizations we'll discuss, the Sumerians, the first great civilization of Mesopotamia, had a king list in which they list the rulers of early Mesopotamia. And one might think, approaching this king list, that it's just going to be what it says, a list of kings. And when you open it up in its translated form, that's what it is. It's a list of kings and a list of years that each king reigned. Well, that's not very interesting for a mythographer, is it? But if you look carefully at the list and you go down the numbers of how long they reigned, you'll see some fellows reigned for a few hundred years or a few thousand years. Well, what does this mean? It's an annalistic piece of history, a list, but there's mythic material embedded in the annal. So scholars have been sifting through this material to find mythic references, and this endeavor has been going on now for approximately 150 years. That's from the beginning of the age of archaeology in the Near East. So we've said something about the definition of myth, a very wide, generous definition, and we're going to be speaking about approaches to myth. How do we understand myth? Let me enumerate 4 of the many approaches. These are 4 of the more helpful approaches. The study of myth has become a very serious academic subject, and there are many books written about these approaches. Let me outline 4. The first can be thought of as myth as ancient science, that myth functions as explanation. What can it explain? It can explain the origins of the earth, the creation of human beings. And this we find in what we call creation material or creation tales. It can explain the social order of the time, why there's hierarchy, why the social order shouldn't be changed. Most importantly, for the political life of the ancient Near East, it served to explain why kings should stay in power, because kings are divinely appointed. Or in the case of Egypt, the kings themselves were divine. And myth can serve to explain and answer some of humanity's greatest questions, especially the question of suffering. Why do people get sick? Why do they die? And the great question, why do the good suffer? The question that we treat under the philosophical category of theodicy. So a way of looking at myth is that the ancients used it to explain the phenomena of their own life. Another approach is that myth refracts and reflects historical reality in an indirect way. So if we read tales of the gods, really, we're reading tales of kings and queens, and their stories are reflected in the tales of the gods. The gods are organized like a royal family. And like all families, they have rivalries, and sometimes they have wars. Myths may disguise historical reality. If we search carefully through them, we can find nuggets of history. This is one approach. And how can we validate our guesses about history? Through archaeology. So here we have the interplay of the mythological material and the archaeological material. For example, there's the great epic of Gilgamesh. Well, that's not exactly a history of Gilgamesh. It's Gilgamesh as a figure who's a combination of the human and the divine. The beginning of the epic tells us that. So someone who's interested in only the strict historical record would say, well, this isn't of any value. But only one aspect of Gilgamesh is found in the epic. There's also historical material about Gilgamesh. Archaeologists have found material that tells us that there was a real Gilgamesh who ruled between 2700 and 2600 BC. Not that he ruled for 100 years, but he ruled in that period. So there's the interplay, again, between archaeology and mythology. So we've spoken about myth as ancient science, myth as a form of history, and third, an approach which we call myth and ritual, an approach which links religious practice and sacred narrative. One expression of this is that in ritual, humans worship the divine. In myth, they express their ideas about the divine and about the world. And this combination of myth and ritual ensures a cosmic harmony. We'll be seeing a number of examples of this. The most explicit example that I'll be offering in our series is the Hittite myth of the god Telepinu, the god of fertility. This god, at times, disappears from the earth, and that explains why there's crop failure and why people starve. Well, he needs to be brought back to earth. How can one bring him back? By reciting a ritual in which you tell the story of how he got lost and how he was found. So the ritual has the effect of bringing back the god, and therefore bringing back the crops and bringing back prosperity. This cosmic harmony, again a modern term to describe the myth and ritual approach and its efficacy, was the basis of life as the ancients understood it. If myth or ritual were disrupted, life itself would be disrupted. Now, the myth and ritual approach also has an interesting intellectual place in 20th century history because it's also an approach to literature. And it's associated with the names of the anthropologists Sir James Frazer of the Golden Bough and of the great Cambridge anthropologist Joan Harrison. The myth and ritual approach says that texts which were for a very long time considered purely literary, such as the Greek dramas or parts of the Hebrew Bible, really had a ritual function in their societies. This myth and ritual approach was combined with a Freudian approach and was very important in the scholarly world of the first half of the 20th century. And speaking of the Freudian approach, we move to our fourth category, that myths embody psychological and spiritual truths. So I mentioned this common notion that myth and truth are opposites, but in the psychological approach, myth is a form of truth, but a psychological form of truth. And the approach focuses on the notion that there are universal themes in all mythologies. We can find commonality in all mythologies, and that this commonality tells us something about human psychology. It sees structural affinities between myths and links them to human perception. So in this approach, we could look at creation myths in many societies, both within the ancient Near East and without. And one observation many scholars make is that many of these creation myths involve separation. Separation of the heavens and the earth. Separation of the waters below and the waters above. Separation of the old gods and the new gods, etc. When humans are created, separation of man from woman. Yes, this is a theme that seems to run through creation myths. Does it run through all? Does it tell us something about the human psyche? These are arguable, but these attitudes are inherent in the psychological approach to myth. I mentioned Freud, who was fascinated by myth and wrote about it quite extensively. Today, the psychological approach to myth is identified with Freud's student and associate, Carl Jung, and he understood that there's a connection between the fantasy and dream life of people of our own time and the myths of ancient times. He saw similarities, both in terms of structure and content. Now, each of these approaches to myth, myth as science, myth as a type of history, myth and its relationship with ritual, and myth as a form of psychological, spiritual truth, has its proponents. Some of these proponents are so wedded to their one approach that they feel that that approach exclusively is the right approach. But I'm not going to take that approach here. Rather, I feel that there's value in all of these. So my attitude is that they are not mutually exclusive. And when we examine individual myths, we will take a variety of approaches to their meaning and function. Before we embark on our study of the stories, of the great stories, we need to review a set of background materials that will enable us to understand the myths in the context in which they first appeared, that is, in their proper historical setting. And I don't only mean we need to do that in this lecture, I mean as part of our series, we're going to go through the materials. First, we will survey the history of the ancient Near East, focusing first on Egypt and on Mesopotamia, then on the Canaanites and the Hittites. Then we will move to the history, a short history of archaeology and the decipherment of the documents. How were these myths uncovered, deciphered? When were they translated? And how were they received? This is something I'll be focusing on. These myths were buried and unknown, many of them, for thousands of years. They caused a real cultural shock in Europe and the United States when they were first read by moderns. So we'll be looking at that reception. Then we will return to the meaning of myth and its function, the four approaches that I just delineated, and against the background of what we've learned in these background lectures, I'll be applying these approaches, myth as science, myth as history, to specific stories, so we can get a sense of the methodology. And in that context, we will have a lecture about the Bible and myth, a theme that we will take up many times in the course, but we need to develop our ideas about it in one lecture. And then in Lecture 8, we will begin our recounting and analysis of individual myths. I start with a description of the pantheons, the families of the gods of the various cultures, move to creation narratives, then to epics, and within the epics to the great epic of Gilgamesh, to which I will devote 2 lectures. So that's our plan. Now I would like to say something about the academic study of the ancient Near East. This study has developed and still operates under a number of different rubrics, a number of disciplinary categories, and I'll be combining those categories. There is no one approach to myth, and there is no one approach to the ancient Near East generally. There are a number of disciplines involved in the study of this area and this time. So what are these categories? The first is the study of ancient languages and texts. This used to be grouped under the rubric of philology, a word that's not very much in favor these days. We favor linguistics. Philology in the sense of love of, in its original meaning, of letters and literature. And we will look at the languages and literatures of the Middle East in their different groupings. First, the study of ancient Egypt under Egyptology, focused on the Egyptian hieroglyphic language in its variations. This is a more unified subject, by which I mean that Egypt was a continuous civilization, ancient Egypt, for approximately 3,000 years. For most of that 3,000 years, it used the same language and had the same culture. So Egyptology, like Egypt itself, is a kind of closed culture. It's engaged with Egypt, of course, which is a great subject, a massive subject. It doesn't really have time for other things. Assyriology, which is the study of the cuneiform script and languages of Mesopotamia, is a more diverse subject because Mesopotamia was a more open culture. I don't mean this as a value judgment. I don't mean open as friendly. I mean open in the sense of diverse, open in the sense of open to invasion. So we have a succession of cultures in Mesopotamia. We have the Sumerians, the Akkadians, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, and their successors. These cultures had different languages. For the most part, they had the same script, the cuneiform script. And this script is studied and taught by Assyriologists. The name Assyriologist comes from Assyria, northern Mesopotamia, and the culture that was dominant there. But the name Assyriologist is generalized to the culture, the study of the culture and cultures of Mesopotamia. Still under philology, we have Semitics, the study of the dominant language group of the ancient Near East. This includes Akkadian, the successor language and culture to the Sumerians. It includes the Hebrew of the Bible and later Semitic languages, such as Arabic and Amharic, the language of Ethiopia. So the Semitic language group crosses over into Africa. It's not only in the Middle East. So that's philology or linguistics. Then we move to archaeology, the excavation and identification of ancient sites and the recovery of their artifacts. Now, these artifacts may include inscriptions, or they may not. If inscriptions are found, they need to be read. In the early periods of archaeology in the Near East, these skills were combined. The archaeologist was the decipherer. In later periods, we have some separation, although, of course, you do still find excavators who read their own finds. But very often, someone is called in to read the inscription, especially in cases where there are many languages. We'll be studying about the great city of Ugarit on the Mediterranean, and we'll be studying the culture of the Hittites to the north in what is now Turkey. In the ruins of these cities, there are tablets found in many languages, 7 or 8 languages. So no one person can master all this material. Well, in the past of archaeology, there have been some greats, but it's not something that's generally done. So we move from philology, archaeology, to religious studies or biblical studies. The Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament of the Christian traditions, emerged from an ancient Near Eastern setting. And much of the early Western interest in the ancient Near East stemmed from a wish to understand the Bible. What was the background of the Bible? That was the cultural question that people were asking. And there were 2 tendencies at work in this cultural inquiry. One was to look at the ancient Near East as a way to challenge the Bible or subvert the Bible. And the other was to use the ancient Near Eastern texts to prove the Bible. So using the same artifacts and inscriptions, 2 different camps went on campaigns. Let me give you some examples of this. In the first excavations in the Middle East, that would be in the mid-19th century. Excavation begins in 1847. The tablets of the flood narrative of the Epic of Gilgamesh were uncovered. And these inscriptions were deciphered, translated, and published in England, in Europe, and in the United States. And immediately, people saw affinities between this story and the story of Noah in the Hebrew Bible. Many readers took this tablet, the flood tablet of the Gilgamesh epic, as a challenge to the Bible. Well, if there's a story from the ancient Near East that tells of a flood, and only one family survived the flood, and that family went on to populate the earth, it shows us that there are stories about floods which aren't biblical, and it might tell us that the story in the Bible isn't original. The term original, very important in the 19th century, comes into play a lot in this conversation. So many people said this is a challenge to biblical authority. Perhaps the authors of the Bible borrowed their stories from the Babylonians. And here, we need to fit this argument, conversation about the Bible, into the greater war between religion and science waging in the 19th century. A war which is not completely over, of course, as we all know, but it was the main cultural war, the Kulturkampf of the 19th century. If the Noah story wasn't original, perhaps other stories weren't original. And if the Bible wasn't original, then it wasn't authoritative. Then why should we live according to the Bible? A rejoinder from the other camp was, perhaps the flood story derived from the Bible. Here's an idea that had already been operating in 18th century England. And it has to do with the history of the European Enlightenment. Perhaps all stories originally came from the Bible, but they were distorted into mythology. So myth is a distortion of biblical revelation. Now, this theory didn't hold up for long because it was proven scientifically that the ancient Near Eastern material was thousands of years old. Other responses to the challenge came, and we will devote a whole lecture to this battle between religion and science as it's expressed in the conversation about the ancient Near East and the Bible. Those eager to see the Bible proved true looked at the texts and at the Bible as the proof of biblical inerrancy. That phrase was used often. I can show you that the Bible is true if you study the ancient Near East. Now, most of this discussion about the Bible and the ancient Near East was focused on the Mesopotamian material, not on the Egyptian. And in the late 19th and early 20th century, we have the development of what scholars then called the pan-Babylonian idea, the idea that everything in the biblical narrative came from Babylon, by which they meant Mesopotamia. In a series of lectures given in 1902, the scholar Friedrich Delitzsch proposed in Berlin that the question of Babel and the Bible was all important for modern culture, and that moderns had to come to terms with the meaning of the ancient Near Eastern material. So we've looked at philology, we've looked at archaeology, we've looked at religious studies. These are three categories under which the ancient Near East has been studied and continues to be studied, and the yield of all of this material can yield a history of the ancient Near East. Because, of course, the peoples of the ancient Near East did not write history in an analytic fashion. They didn't create analytic histories that we can go refer to. Now, the myths and general literary products of the ancient Near East have a relevance beyond the literary, academic, and religious. And this relevance might surprise you. It's in the modern political arena. So we're not only studying a subject that has an interest to antiquarians, but it touches on modern political questions. Because the nationalisms of the modern Middle East have evoked the gods and heroes of the ancient Near Eastern myths. An illustration that I think will speak to all of us is that Saddam Hussein continually evoked the ancient Near Eastern glories of Babylon and Assyria in his campaign to present himself as the great leader of his people. He not only did it in rhetoric, he rebuilt the ruins of Babylon to the dismay of many archaeologists. And he put bricks in the rebuilding with his name on it. Well, his is an extreme version of this connection between nationalism and archaeology. We see it in modern Egypt and its connection with the ancient Egyptians. We see it in modern Turkey and its connection with the Hittites. We see it in modern Israel and its connection with biblical Israel. Thus, our subject, myth and its study, has great contemporary relevance and great intellectual richness. It is relevant outside the walls of the academy and in the halls of diplomacy. Archaeology and nationalism are intimately linked in the cultures I have mentioned. In this lecture, we have examined reasons for studying ancient Near Eastern mythology, surveyed academic ideas on the definition and function of myth, and looked at the roots and the branches of the study of the ancient Near East, a study that bases itself on philology, archaeology, religious studies, and history. In our next lecture, we will begin our investigation of the civilizations of the ancient Near East, focusing first on Egypt and Mesopotamia. We will focus on these civilizations, their accomplishments, and I will suggest some comparisons between the two cultures.